Today we'll be taking a look at Need for Speed on the PS4 and the Potato Masher. If you don't know, the Potato Masher is a $375 PC custom built in 2014 and designed to compete with the PS4 for the rest of its life cycle. The goal is not to pick on consoles, but to show that PC gaming can be just as good or better for the same money. The project was started by the Casual Shenanigans Gaming Podcast, so go check us out using the link on screen. You can support the Potato Masher project and my channel by tossing me a few bucks on Patreon to help me test new games quicker and better. If you support me at the $3 per main game review level, you'll get to see all Potato Masher videos a few days early. Lastly, this video was recorded and uploaded at 60 FPS, so switch to that if your browser supports it. Unrelated to this review in particular, I'm going to do a Q&A video soon, so drop any questions about the Potato Masher or my channel that you have in the comments and I'll answer as many as I can. Alright, let's get to it. Ever since I heard that Ghost Games was using Frostbite for the Need for Speed reboot, I was excited. Performance issues aside, that engine has been one of my favorites from a visual standpoint, and I was excited to see what it could do with a racing game. Well, I wasn't disappointed. I originally bought the game on PS4 when it released last fall, and I think Ghost did an excellent job with the visuals. The rain-soaked neon streets instantly restored the feeling of Need for Speed Underground, even if the gameplay didn't quite measure up. The PS4 runs the game at 1080p and 30 FPS, so I set that as the target for the Masher. At very high settings, the Masher only had a few small stability issues. From reading online, when loading new areas of the city, it is common to get a small frame rate drop for a few seconds, and I did experience that. It might be better if the game is being run off an SSD, but it was only mildly annoying and fairly infrequent. Much more aggravating were the anti-aliasing options for the game. Simply put, both suck. Need for Speed's implementation of FXAA might as well not be on, as it didn't seem to do anything for the aliasing. There were numerous light artifacts on the taillights and more angular surfaces on the cars and roads. Here in the garage, it's very obvious. You might also notice that the PS4 footage looks noticeably softer. To me, it almost looks like the game is running at 900p on the console. However, this is temporal anti-aliasing. TAA fixes all of the light artifacts by smearing a layer of Vaseline all over your screen and hoping you won't notice how blurry everything is in the background. I recorded footage using both FXAA and TAA on the Masher, so you'll notice both in this video. Everything with the BRZ is using FXAA, and everything with the Datsun uses TAA. I grudgingly accepted that TAA is probably the better looking solution, but I understand why so many mods online revolve around sharpening the image again. If the Masher wasn't so maxed out at very high settings, I would have run the game at a slightly higher resolution than native, as that usually is the best anti-aliasing option. Other than aliasing, both versions looked very comparable. Textures and anisotropic filtering appeared to be slightly better on the Masher, but when everything was in motion it was hard to see a difference. I also think there may have been slightly more pop-in on the PS4, but it was not distracting and was barely different if at all. If the Masher was to have any advantage, it would have to be with higher frame rates or better resolutions. I ended up selling my PS4 copy of Need for Speed a month after release because the game's controls were so frustrating. There was noticeable lag in the controls, which I assumed was probably related to the frame rate as well as the overall handling model. Granted, I'm a big fan of Forza and Gran Turismo, so I do like more simulator handling setups, but I've played most of the Need for Speed games and I did enjoy the old ones. When the game released on PC, I tried it on my personal gaming rig and ended up dropping the resolution to 1080p so I could game at 60 FPS. The game felt completely different, and the still poor handling model felt much better with the high frame rate, reducing the perceived lag. So, on the Potato Masher, I felt like 60 FPS was pretty important. At very low settings, the Potato Masher couldn't hit 60 reliably, with frame rate drops into the mid-40s. There simply aren't enough graphics options that can be adjusted to reduce the load on the GPU far enough to let the game run smoothly at 60 FPS and 1080p. Besides much more pop-in, the game still looks pretty decent at very low settings, but that's because there isn't much of a difference in the visual settings. Much like Dark Souls 3, the game ranges from pretty good looking to quite good looking, but it never looks bad because they don't give you enough options to turn down. Dirt Rally can look like a PS2 game if you reduce the settings far enough, but it'll also run on a huge range of hardware. It would have been nice to see that with Need for Speed. I ended up reducing the resolution to 720p, and at high settings the Masher stayed at 60 FPS and the difference in car handling was very noticeable. There was of course much more aliasing because of the lower resolution, so you'd have to decide if frame rate or resolution was more important. For this game, I think frame rate makes a bigger difference in how good the cars feel and how frustrated you'll get when the arcadey handling takes over. Because I felt that the pop-in was too high at very low settings, I only reduced the visuals to low when I tested 1440p. It worked fine for the most part, but there were more frame rate drops than there were at 1080p. The level of detail was noticeably better, and the TAA didn't look as bad at a higher resolution. Still, it didn't run amazingly well overall, and I don't think the masher could play 1440p acceptably. Of course, I tested 4K and it didn't really work at all. Frostbite is a demanding engine and the masher does have limits. If a winner has to be picked, the masher's flexibility gave it a slight edge. The ability to lower visual settings and resolutions to game at a higher frame rate is great, especially for a shooter or racing game. However, the two versions were almost identical in most other respects. Both platforms did well. If you enjoyed this video, check out the original build video or any of the other Potato Masher videos linked on screen. You can also follow me on Twitter, check out the Casual Shenanigans Gaming podcast, or support the project on Patreon. Also, remember to drop your questions in the comments below for the upcoming Q&A video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.